So good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to folks who are joining from other time zones. Thank you for joining this webinar today about Demographic Dividend Luminaries. Today, we have the great pleasure of having Gretchen Donehower as our guest, and she's going to be talking about the price tag of women's work at home. So my name is Cardona, and I'm going to be moderating this webinar. I am an assistant scientist at Johns Hopkins, and I also coordinate the work on demographic dividend at the Gates Institute. Today, we have the privilege of having three great panelists, and our guest as a DD Luminary today is Gretchen Donehower. Gretchen is a demographer, and she's affiliated at the University of California at Berkeley. Gretchen has vast experience conducting research on demographic dividends, particularly with the National Transfer Account methodology, to which she pioneered and introduced the gender lens into the NTA methodological approach by including the National Time Transfer Account. In addition, she is the director of the Counting Women's Work project, of which we will be listening more about in this presentation. In addition to Gretchen, we also have the participation of Dr. Ian Salas, who is an applied microeconomist and an assistant scientist at Johns Hopkins University, and he's the one who led the conversation with Gretchen. And finally, we're going to have a discussion session with Dr. Christophe Rusatira, who has also worked on demographic dividend and is currently pursuing a Ph.D. at Johns Hopkins University. So without further ado, let's listen more from Gretchen.
Dr. Gretchen Donehower, thank you for joining us for this interview.
Can you share with us how you started working on the demographic dividend?
Of course, and thank you for the invitation. So I first heard about the concept of demographic dividend and demographic dividend analysis as part of work on the National Transfer Accounts Project, or NTA. So NTA is now a global research network with teams in over 60 countries. And we're all trying to understand the age dimension of our economies. So how we produce, consume, and share resources by age. And NTA does that by getting sort of monetary estimates by age group of how much people are producing and consuming. And that links with demographic dividend analysis because DD analysis is about how age structure change over time through the demographic transition can favor production over consumption, can favor productivity at the population level. And so that was long been discussed with things like old age dependency ratios or child dependency ratios, where we're just looking at proportions of people in one age group or another and how that might change over time. But what NTA allows us to do is actually have a monetary estimate of how those population changes are going to favor productivity over consumption over time. So they give us sort of a point estimate in a monetary unit of how much potential there is to realize a demographic dividend.
So you mentioned the National Transfer Accounts, and I know you've done a lot of work to extend that work. What are those ways by which you built on that work and help you to understand more about the gendered economy?
Yeah, so the NTA is sort of built on, and when it was conceptualized, and I should say it was started by Ron Lee at UC Berkeley and Andy Mason at the University of Hawaii a few decades ago. And their initial idea about understanding the age dimension of economies was to build on the existing framework of national accounting. So national accounting gives us internationally comparable measures like GDP, total consumption, total taxes, so aggregate measures for a nation. And NTA sort of pulled those apart by age. And using that national accounting framework as a basis means that whatever isn't in national accounting is also not in NTA, in our estimate understanding of the age dimension of economic activity. So this is a shortcoming, and this is a long-held critique about national accounts. NTA wasn't the first group to make this, but the big thing that is left out in terms of people's productivity and people's sort of productive energies was unpaid care work. So direct care for persons done for no pay, indirect care through housework, household maintenance, household management, things like that. Those are not part of national accounting. And this is a limitation of the NTA system as when it was begun. And so we started in the NTA network, the Counting Women's Work Project, to add this unpaid care work piece into the NTA framework to understand the age dimension of the market economy measured by national accounts, but also the unpaid care work economy, and bringing in that part of our economy also brings in the gendered aspect, because when we look at how people spend their work time, women in every economy that we've looked at do more of this unpaid care work labor than men. Men are doing more market work than women. So really, the economic measurement has a gender dimension to it to begin with.
How would you say this must be really challenging work? Because you mentioned that it's been excluded from the economic accounting concepts, that unpaid care work that are mostly done by women. And so you must have done a lot of work to be able to integrate that in some way. Can you share some of your experiences trying to figure out how to best count women's work?
Yeah, so there are many people ever since the beginning of national accounting who've made this critique about what is left out of national accounting. And in response to that, they've developed household production satellite accounting. So the satellite account idea is that we can add something into this existing system. And so using time use surveys, the people who developed household production satellite accounting methods use time use surveys to figure out how much time people are spending caring for children, caring for elders, cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, etc. And then valuing that time by an imputed wage. How much would I have to pay somebody to do this work for me on a market basis if I wasn't going to do it on an unpaid basis? So that is the basic method of household production satellite accounting, which existed long before Counting Women's Work got into it. And what we added was the NTA perspective on age disaggregation. So we have that methodology we call national time transfer accounts, measures the production and consumption of unpaid care work. And so we can sort of combine that with the NTA production and consumption estimates for the market economy and get a look at the total economy. So there is an existing methodology standing on the shoulders of giants to bring the NTA perspective of the age dimension into this new methodology called national time transfer accounts, which is the basis of Counting Women's Work Project.
It sounds to me like you were marrying the two different fields, right? Looking at age disaggregation for the economic accounts. And then on the gender dimension, there is work there, but the age has access has not been introduced as well as you have done. So can you give us a sense of how challenging was it to be able to marry those two, or how and how receptive people have been in terms of seeing the fusion of these two different fields so far?
Yeah, so the big challenges in unpaid care work and the national time transfers accounts methodology are data availability. First of all, because time use surveys are much less common than the kinds of labor force or expenditure or living standard surveys that already exist. So having the time use data is a big challenge. And then the degree across countries is also a big challenge. I mean, that's true in any kind of cross-country comparative research, but particularly true here because time use surveys can vary a lot but they are in some ways becoming more standardized. And also the availability of time use data is being addressed by the UN and other players in international statistics, trying to develop a sort of pared down module that can be inserted into other surveys asking about these main kinds of tasks. And so that's a really hopeful sign for the future, being able to do more national time transfer accounts work if we have more and more standardized time use surveys across countries.
Here are some of those key findings that you have on this Counting Women's Work project that you lead to measure the gendered economy?
Mm-hmm. So we have not quite as many countries in counting women's work with the time transfer accounts as in NTA, but we have about 25 or so now with completed estimates. We're working to get more all the time. And so across the countries that we do have, the biggest finding at the aggregate level is the huge amount of time that people are spending on this work. So across different countries, 18 different countries, for example, we get measures from this work at the aggregate level being up to 60% of all work time is unpaid care work. Down at the bottom for other countries, down to a low of 30%. But on average, across a large group of very diverse countries, it's about 50% of all work time is unpaid care work time. And this doesn't even include concepts like supervisory time, where I might not be sort of providing care directly, but I'm responsible, say, for a young child or for a vulnerable elder, things like that. So it's a huge amount of time. It's a huge amount of what our productive energies go to at the population level. And to think of this being sort of left out of a lot of international statistics is makes you realize what a huge oversight it is not to understand and include unpaid care work in these analyses. It's also when we value this production with a replacement wage, we get estimates compared to market economies that are somewhat smaller than just comparing on a time basis, but still range anywhere from, say, 20% up to 30 or 40% of this value of this unpaid care work time relative to GDP. So the sort of biggest thing is what a large amount of the economy this kind of work is. Most of it is unpaid. When we look at the care economy, including the market piece and the unpaid care work piece in the few countries that we've been able to look at in that way so far, the unpaid care work side of the economy dwarfs the paid care economy. And even in developed countries where you would think that there may be a large paid sector with a lot of people using childcare or using market-based elder care, but still the unpaid side is much larger. In every single country, as I think I mentioned before, women are specializing in this kind of work. But there is a big range of sort of how much unpaid care work is being done by women versus men across countries. In some of the countries where there's a largest gender gap in this work, say Senegal, South Africa are a few examples, it's about 80% of this amount of work being done by women compared to 20% for men. Down at the other end of the scale, we have countries like Denmark, Sweden, the US, where women are doing about 70% of this work compared to 20% for men, or sorry, yes, 30% for men. So that's closer than the range at the top, but it's still a big majority being done by women. But the fact that there is a lot of variation across countries says that there's nothing sort of biologically determined about how this work is shared. It really depends on how each country constructs their care economy, cultural ideas, economic ideas, legal frameworks, things like that. So there is room for change if there are aspects to the gender nature of the care economy that are not serving all of the people in those economies. And then one other aspect, I think, of the way counting women's work looks at unpaid care work that is unique in other researchers studying the care economy is that we also estimate who is consuming this time. So there's usually a big emphasis on sort of who's producing this time. But in the national time transfer accounts, we also get who is consuming the time and how it's being transferred from productive age groups to consuming age groups. So what we find is that children are the biggest consumers of this unpaid care work time. And elders are consuming this time too, which we might think there's going to be a ton of elder care needs. That's a big concern for a lot of people in terms of population aging. But what we also find is that older people are incredibly productive in this kind of work as well. They are caring for each other, they're caring for older spouses or a disabled spouse. They're also caring for their grandchildren. So they're all not just consuming this kind of work, they're also producing it. But in terms of children producing this work, it's also really important to understand in terms of human capital dynamics. So when we look at everything that a child consumes in its first year, 90% of an infant's consumption is unpaid care work. If we compare the amount that they're consuming in terms of market goods and services, say housing and clothing and things like that, and food, but compared to taking all the amount of time they're receiving in care from adults and value that at a child care wage, that unpaid care work is 90% of all that consumption. So thinking about what children consume and how we invest in children, it's really important to understand the dynamics of unpaid care work to really get that system complete.
Striking finding that 90% of what young children consume is can be attributed to the care that they receive from their caregivers and their parents in most cases.
Yeah, and that's even valuing that time at a childcare wage, which is in most every country quite a low wage. So it's very startling to me. And that is just the first year. As children age, that changes a lot. But for that first year, unpaid care work is the vast majority of what children are consuming and what we are investing in their human capital.
What would you consider to be the policy implications of these startling findings?
So one of the big policy messages from our work, I think, is that care work, while we often talk about it in terms of being a burden, and because it might be inequitably distributed to women versus men, it's also an investment. It is something that we want to share as a society equitably, but is one of the most important ways that we invest in the next generation, that we create the workers of the future, that we create the society of the future. So its size and importance in those terms is something that I think our project can stress pretty well and back it up with data. Then also, of course, there are sort of the more traditional reasons that people talk about unpaid care work in the policy space, which is that it can keep women out of the labor force if they are not able to sort of adjust these unpaid care work responsibilities, either using market providers or having subsidized market provision of this kind of care work, or sharing it more equitably with men in households.
How about for women's human capital investment? Do you have some implications that you can draw out from your research and data as well?
Yeah, so one of the things that we can look at is sort of specialization in productive energies. And so when we look at who is doing the unpaid care work, as young as we can measure in these surveys, we see girls doing more of this work, specializing in this kind of work, while boys are doing plenty of unpaid labor in many contexts, but the kind of unpaid labor they're doing is more sort of market oriented. So young girls will be caring for younger siblings or helping the mother with unpaid care work activities, while a boy might be helping with livestock or working in a shop or something like that. So that's sort of pushing boys and girls' human capital development into different directions. And at the same time that the world has made so much progress in kind of equalizing investments in education for girls and boys at the primary level, there's so much progress towards gender parity in girls and boys attending primary school, less so at secondary and higher levels of education. But in this kind of gendered way that we are having children do unpaid labor, we're really sort of pushing their human capital in ways that are realized throughout life. So I think that is one area that we could really use some more research on, sort of how boys and girls human capital are being shaped outside of just our strict understanding of human capital development being what happens in school.
I haven't really thought of it in that way, that it really the term I want to use is that those hidden things that when they become visible, they will strike you as pretty obvious, because that's how the situation has been in many places, right? But we don't have the facility of conversing or discussing those issues, because we haven't had the data or the opportunity to develop models to look at things more comprehensively, as you have done. So really great to see a lot of progress, thanks to you and your colleagues. I think at this point, I want to ask you about what people have been calling the gender dividend. To you, what is the gender dividend? And what do you think are some of the common misperceptions that people might have about it?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different ways that I see discussions of gender dividends out there in the world, in the research world. As related to demographic dividends, there is sort of the idea that as part of the changes that lead to populations moving through demographic transition, so going from high fertility, high mortality to lower fertility, lower mortality, that those transitions also come with things like greater schooling for girls and other kinds of social or economic changes that might lead to higher labor force participation for women over time. When I think about demographic dividends in terms of NTA and counting women's work, what we really think about is the freed up time that when you have fewer children, and as we were saying before, that children are the greatest consumers of this unpaid care work time, you have the potential to use that productive energy in other capacities. So you could either have more intensive child rearing, so fewer children will get more sort of hours of parental time, and that might have productive investment or productivity payoff down the road for those children. Or it might be an inefficient use of time. You might be sort of doing too much parenting per child, and then it's not a very efficient sort of deployment of those time resources. So how else might that time be used? Well, in some contexts where women are experiencing a great deal of time poverty, they have less time for self-care, less time for any kind of leisure activity that contributes to their well-being. Then that sort of freed up time from having fewer children to take care of could possibly go towards alleviating that time poverty and enhancing well-being. The third option is that freed up time could go towards the labor market, could enhance female labor force participation, enhance women's access to income, to money income, which can have all kinds of other social benefits and well-being benefits for women. Now that is contingent upon there being good jobs to have. So it's not much of a well-being enhancement if you go from doing a lot of unpaid care work to doing a very low paid, very precarious job. So part of realizing this gender dividend is emphasis on job quality. Another way that we can sort of miss out on this gender dividend is if we free up women's time, but then we don't have any support for at the cultural level for sort of women in a market workplace. So I think we see there are several countries in which over time there is enhanced per capita income, there's economic growth, but we actually see falling female labor force participation. And some of this can get down to that sort of good job, bad job thing that as an economy gets richer, maybe women don't have to take those precarious jobs, which might be the only ones they can get. And then a household is sort of able to realize a desire to have more unpaid care work done in the household versus a market work. But it can also be sort of a cultural preference that maybe doesn't serve anymore, that women just shouldn't be doing market labor. And the minute we get a little bit richer, we're going to use our riches to buy women out of the labor force. So that might be realizing a preference, but it also might be inefficient, and it might be realizing someone's preferences and not at the expense of someone else. So to be able to have those big cultural conversations about, if to go from a context in which it was very unacceptable culturally for women to work, how do we feel about that now? Is it a different situation? Are there legal supports that can be provided to make the workplace more welcoming for women? Are there other kinds of structural investments in things like transportation or other sort of public service provisions that can make it possible for women and make it more desirable for women to enter the market labor force? And then also, are there public supports on paid care providers, subsidized childcare, subsidized elder care, that can sort of allow households to better sort of trade off unpaid care work with paid care work and enhance overall population productivity and women's access to the labor markets?
Most people now recognize that the demographic dividend is not automatic. Would you say the same thing for the gender dividend?
Absolutely. Yeah. The potential for a gender dividend, and just like the potential for the demographic dividend, is something that we can see in the data, that we can see in projections, but is contingent upon all sorts of other dynamics. So with the demographic dividend, the thing we emphasize is that it's about increased productivity, but you have to be able to deploy that productivity in some useful way. And the more efficiently you can do that, the more of an enhancement you'll get in your ultimate growth. So with the gender dividend, same thing. It's a potential to move productive capacities into other areas that can be overall productivity enhancing. But if you don't also have policies in place that allow greater choice by women and by families, that make workplaces open to women, then you won't get as much of a gender dividend as you might have. Or you will get the opposite of a gender dividend. You will actually sort of reduce women's deployment of productive capacities in the market, as we've seen in some instances. So it's a matter of potential, just like demographic dividends, but it's also pretty clear what kinds of policies give you the opportunity to realize that potential.
What kinds of insights would be helpful for someone interested in learning more about the gender economy? What background, what skills, etc., etc.?
Yeah. Certainly, it's a lot more than just economics. It's a lot more than demography. As I think best practices in all social sciences now are to broaden our frames of reference and our understanding of different frameworks to analyze situations. In the policy realm, the biggest thing that I think advancing studies, understanding, and well-being through learning about unpaid care work are in having these conversations, sometimes in different contexts. To discuss anything about unpaid care work can seem like an invasion of the household or an intrusion into private space that can be very unwelcome. So to be able to have these conversations at various levels, respectfully and with a true eye towards enhancing well-being and human flourishing, as opposed to sort of very narrow goals, say around per capita GDP growth, or even sort of time use allocations between women or men or something, to get beyond narrow targets and talk about these systems as a whole in a way that people can really understand how it affects their lives and their futures is a skill that I try to have. Sometimes I'm successful at it, sometimes not, but is a fascinating part of engaging in this work.
I just want to thank you for indulging us with this conversation and for helping us see what kinds of interesting work are being done by you and other colleagues to make the gendered economy more visible to all of us, and to encourage the discussion around equity and gender equality.
Thank you, Gretchen, for that great conversation. We enjoyed it very much. And now we're going to have the discussion that is led by Dr. Jean-Christophe Rusatira.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the great presentation, Gretchen. So we've prepared a couple of slides that we kind of just to have a little bit of reflection. We are focusing on the sub-Saharan African countries. Then we have a couple of questions that we would like you to elaborate more on. So as highlighted, definitely the population transition is happening. And as you all can see on this map presented here, you can see that the green and light green highlighted countries are mostly in Africa. And those are countries that are classified as pre-dividend. So basically those countries that have a total fertility rate of less than 4 children per woman, and that has like a population that is expected to grow in the current decade, pretty much. And those countries with light green, those are countries that are seen as early dividend. Excuse me, so the early dividend, those are the countries that have less than 4 children per woman. In the darker green, those are the pre-dividend countries that have a fertility rate that's 4 and above, greater than 4. And the population is also expected to grow, and that's based on the World Bank classification. And it's also highlighted on the graph. You can see in red, in circle, those are low middle income countries that has like a high proportion of the population as of 2015, when this map was drawn. So we are going to focus on the 2 countries that were included in the work that was presented. So as you saw, there were 18 countries included, and for sub-Saharan Africa countries, there were Senegal and Ghana. And we've shared here the population pyramid of those 2 countries for you all to have a look. And as you can see, Senegal definitely has a much wider base, although their population, their total fertility rate is definitely now around 4.4. And compared to Ghana, Ghana has a total fertility rate of around 3.6 now, and that was coming from around 5.1 in 2000 and 4.4 in 2010. So clearly there's been a fast decline in total fertility rate, but as you can see, the population is still quite young. So there are definitely opportunities to reap the demographic dividend in those countries. Next. So as also highlighted, we would like to kind of discuss a little bit more on the pattern that was observed. So as you all saw in Senegal and Ghana, definitely the market work share is pretty high, is around 50%. But there are still large gaps between men and women. So we'll request Gretchen to expand a little bit on that and whether there are some mechanisms that may be involved as highlighted that may have to do with culture, that may have to do with culture change, that may have to do with access to jobs, that may have to do with education or what the human capital actually that's in those countries. So Gretchen, once I'm done with these few slides, we definitely would appreciate a few words from you about this. So I probably will let you address those two questions before I ask a few more questions that I thought are worth to reflect on.
Okay, so thank you very much for those questions and for your thoughts on the situation in sub-Saharan Africa. So certainly, I mean, so these two charts are sort of contrasting different things. The first one on the left is the aggregate unpaid care work and market work across everyone, men and women combined. So there's a lot of difference in how the time use surveys are sort of measuring unpaid care work. So some of this is certainly a little bit noisy, but I mean, the reason that there's sort of less unpaid care work in some of those countries, they are generally sort of lower income countries. And there's a lot of market work that is being done in the informal economies as well. We try to calculate or also include not just formal work in that blue market work piece, but informal work and unpaid family workers. So if anyone in the family is working on, say, a family farm or a family-owned shop or something, those are also included in the blue. So that's the kind of work that's much larger in countries with a greater sort of informal economies. So that's some of why you get some of Senegal and Ghana down there. There's a lot of unpaid family work. There's a lot of informal work in those countries. Now, Senegal and Ghana are also at two really kind of different places in terms of the specialization and the gender gap in who is doing the unpaid care work piece that's shown in the right side. And in my experience, it's very path dependent. Countries organize their care economies very differently. And this is not just a sort of high income, low income economy thing. There are high income countries like Germany and like Italy that have sort of more ideas about women's role maintaining the family. And so you can also get, big gaps in countries that have high incomes. You can get a really big difference between Senegal and Ghana there in who is doing the unpaid care work, even though, say, on the total market work versus unpaid care work, they were kind of closer. So, I mean, that's why in structuring the National Transfer Accounts Project and the Counting Women's Work Project, we work with research teams that are in country, because I mean, the research teams in Senegal, in Ghana, who've been doing this work with me for years now, are much more knowledgeable about sort of why we see the patterns we do. So, I mean, I think also there's a great deal of opportunity in countries where we have those huge gender gaps and who's doing what, to highlight that and have discussions about, you know, is this still the way we want to deploy our resources? Is this system still serving us in terms of everyone's outcomes, everyone's well-being? So I don't know, that was sort of a wishy-washy answer, I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. That actually leads to another question that I had when I was reflecting on these findings. For example, when you look at South Africa and you look at Ghana and Senegal, actually, Carol, maybe you can bring back that slide so that people can see what we are talking about. So when you look at Senegal and South Africa, we know that they are in two different kind of economic categories. But when you look at like total fertility, we already know that South Africa is around 2.4, which is quite close to fertility replacement level. And we have Senegal that has like fertility that's around 4.2, 4.4. But when you look at their market work share, they are also a little bit close, but the gaps between men and women, they also seem to be pretty close. But so can you elaborate more on that? And given like the economic kind of situation, when you look at South Africa and Senegal, that are a little bit different, but still the gaps doesn't seem to have been really closed between men and women. And I think that's definitely something that I'm personally very interested in, and hopefully other people may also be interested in hearing more about.
Yeah, I mean, so some of this, I mean, certainly the situation in South Africa and somewhat in Senegal, but less so, but also has to do with sort of seasonal labor. So a lot of husbands and fathers in South Africa are leaving the household for long periods of time to do market work elsewhere. And so the mothers, the wives are staying at home, and because the fathers are gone, are doing a lot of this work. And so that plays into some of those patterns where there's a lot of seasonal migration for market work, access to income, that's sort of a byproduct of separating out opportunities to participate in the unpaid care work economy. And still a lot of it is a lot of cultural ideas about who is supposed to do what. In Senegal and in a lot of Francophone West Africa, we've also seen a lot of women's role maintaining the sort of social networks of the family. So women are expected to do a lot of entertaining, a lot of connecting with other households and sort of other family members in different households to sort of maintain the social standing and opportunities for their families. And so this is a kind of unpaid care work, but it's very sort of socially prescribed that this is women's role to keep up, and it takes a lot of time and it provides a lot of resources for the household. And that really is just sort of a cultural practice that's in that region, and many women are sort of pushing back against those ideas that, you know, this has to be their job, or that this job has to be done so intensively that it takes a ton of time from them and sort of leaves them maybe less time for other kinds of opportunities. So certainly in the sub-Saharan Africa context, Counting Women's work as a project tries to have some of these conversations. We try to reach out to, say, African women's feminist organizations. And we try to have a lot of conversations in the policy space that are sharing research rather than sort of finishing our project and saying, here's what we learned. But that's something that we've tried to pursue in Counting Women's Work recently, in partnership with the Population Reference Bureau and our Counting Women's Work research teams in the region.
That's great. So I had another question that as you were speaking, I thought it's definitely worth looking at. So for people working in the domain of family planning, and we know that based on progress with modern contraception use in different countries, and where the total fertility reduction has probably not necessarily experienced progress as people were thinking. But as I was reflecting here, it does not seem that with total fertility rate reduction is not necessarily being accompanied with the reduction in that gap between men and women, which actually, like scientists, sometimes we use this theory as one way to kind of really prove why human rights based promotion of family planning matters. So how do people working in family planning should kind of pivot or maybe adapt their strategies to make sure that as they are promoting contraceptive use, they can also make sure that those dividends of allowing people to actually contribute more to the economy is actually happening, of course, making sure that women are also equally part of that progress.
Yeah, so I think certainly increasing the awareness about sort of the overall family building strategy and the sort of life cycle of the family is also about sort of these productive energies, and that people realize that when they have fewer children, there is potential to realize other ways to deploy their sort of productive energies in the world, or to use their skills and abilities. And I mean, as I was saying in the interview, that it is important, therefore, with sort of demographic dividend strategies, that we also think about gender strategies to address any ideas or legal limitations or lack of other kinds of investment that keep women out of the market labor force. And I mean, this has long been a critique in the demographic dividend space as well, that without gender supportive policies, not just sort of investment policies across the whole future workers, that you won't necessarily get the kind of dividend that you're hoping to get. You will instead perhaps get, a lower female labor force participation over time with economic growth, which sounds very counterintuitive to many people who observe it, but makes sense when you think about the fact that you can have economic growth in a context of continued negative ideas about women, especially mothers, working in market labor. So I sort of lost my train of thought there, but so I think to focus on the fact that you have a potential for this whole new phase of life and way to be in the world. Now, there are places, especially places that have ideas about female seclusion as well, where you can miss out on this productive capacity because there are such strict ideas about sort of how women should be spending their time. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. That's all I had prepared. So the mic is back to you, Carolina. Please take it on.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Gretchen. That was a very illustrating discussion. Now we're going to take questions from the audience, and please, you can you can type them on the Q&A box, and kind of start with a question from Lise Madsen from PRB. I'm gonna read it, Gretchen, and also for the audience. It says, do you see any difference in potential for the second demographic dividend based on countries' relative differentials in gender care work? In other words, if countries with more gender equitable unpaid care work also have higher or longer levels of female participation in the formal workforce, do they also have higher savings levels that contribute to the second demographic dividend?
This is a great question. I thank you so much. This may be our next grant proposal because I have not really looked at this. I mean, in some ways, it's just sort of an empirical question of where, women have been deploying their productive capacities more equally between unpaid care work and market work. Do we see that sort of as throughout their whole life course? Is that a potential sort of benefit of kind of a more diversification in your productive capacities, that you're sort of able to continue market work for longer than you might have been otherwise? It's certainly potential is there. The data to sort of see this is going to be the big problem, because we don't have tons of longitudinal data on this, and it's kind of a bit of a longitudinal question. And I mean, generally about the second demographic dividend, there are lots of ideas about what that means, just like lots of ideas about what gender dividends mean. Certainly, I mean, at least in the NTA idea, the kind of narrow interpretation we have on it is that as you get older, you have the potential to have a greater store of savings, which can be used to make your physical capital more productive. So even when you have sort of fewer workers, you can kind of enhance their ability to produce with more physical capital. And so certainly a second sort of gender dividend could potentially be having women who were able to invest more in their human capital beyond what they sort of might in unpaid care work. You might have a potential for a second demographic gender dividend as well. But that's a great question for us to look at going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box, but I do see a comment from Emmy Hughes. She says, thank you for such an interesting talk and great questions on the interview from Ian. So it is 1:57. We still have time for one more questions if there are any comments from the audience. But if not, I do have one follow-up question, Gretchen, which I think we've kind of briefly talked about this, but I know that India is not part of the countries you have in your sample, but I also know that India is going through some interesting changes in terms of the women's labor force participation, because it's the first time that the country is seeing a decline in women's participation in the labor market. Yet, of course, their economy is growing, it's booming. And I also heard in your interview, in your presentation, that you were discussing that it is also possible that as the development happens, it might be more socially appreciated if women are not part of the labor market, or it was something like that. So if you can comment more on that, please.
Certainly, yeah. So we do have India in the sample, but it's from the 1999 time use survey. So getting older all the time. Although there is new data on India, and we hope to use the 2019 survey to update that soon. And hopefully that will give us a little more insight into what is going on. But certainly there are some countries, and India is the biggest example, where as it has gotten richer, women have worked less in the labor market. And there are, as you mentioned, sort of, I think, two parts to that. Well, one is that there is a lot of overall social preference to have women doing unpaid care work instead of market work, that as we can afford it, we as a society would prefer those women to stay in the home. Those women may not prefer it themselves, who knows? But And then there's also an issue of, as we get richer, if the only jobs that women were able to do were very low paid, very precarious, I mean, things like sort of working construction, working in kind of temporary labor, street vendors, like kinds of things where the pay is low, it's a difficult job. And if, say, your husband is able to make more money because the economy is growing, then the household may be able to realize a preference for not having the wife take a very unpleasant, precarious job. So, I mean, it's sort of two different stories. One is about kind of job quality, and one is about sort of social preference. And I mean, I think that there are a lot of very vibrant conversations going on in India about those issues, and how that's going to proceed is unknown. There are also sort of some structural issues with making kind of market labor more accessible for women. Say they need to be able to feel safer in public transportation, have more opportunities to widen job searches away from a household, which is linked to transportation options. So there are a lot of different stories in India, but certainly as an overall development kind of picture, the idea that this is sort of the most efficient use of half of the population's sort of productive capacities seems like the policymakers should absolutely realize that this is something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Gretchen. That's, yeah, a very interesting policy implications from what is happening in India. We're going to take one more question because we started a bit late. It's Kimberly Mihail. She says, to what extent is the increase in market work among women in sub-Saharan Africa also enabled by cheaper childcare and more family support for women to enable them to participate in the labor force?
So this is a fascinating question, and I am not as familiar with sort of some of the literature in this area. I have seen some really interesting studies about sort of making paid childcare available at very highly subsidized rates, and sort of trying to use those programs to prove that families in sub-Saharan Africa are as open to using, say, paid childcare providers as people any place else. There was a sort of somewhat of a common idea that sort of this was unacceptable for many families in many different countries in Africa and would never fly. And so some of these projects were trying to prove that that's not true. If there are good options that are affordable, families in sub-Saharan Africa would take advantage of those just like anybody else would. And so I think those programs were successful and did demonstrate that people wanted to access those resources. So the more that that's made available, I think the more families in sub-Saharan Africa will be able to sort of allocate their care responsibilities to themselves, mother, father, whoever the other adults are, versus paid care providers in a way that's optimal for them. So certainly, if that paid care economy piece is growing either sort of on its own through market demand or through government subsidies, I think that's certainly a positive for the potential development of overall economies and of women being able to access market labor.
Thank you, Gretchen. So our time is up. Thanks to everyone who joined, and a big thank you and applause to Gretchen, Ian, and Chris for having this conversation about the gender dividend. We're going to be posting the recording of the session, and we're also going to be sharing it. So thanks everyone for their participation.
Thank you, everyone.